Buckminster Fuller has this great quote about how you don't change society by criticizing or refusing the existing system. You change it by building a new model and allowing people to gravitate towards that new model. I think this is true in terms of how you should go about changing society, and I also think it's true in terms of tactics. I think it's what works. I think rhetorically, spending all of your time in disagreements, it doesn't really work. I've seen lots of people get into arguments, and so many of the times, even when people feel like they're arguing about stuff that's super important, the stuff they're arguing about are these little pedantic distinctions. It's vibes a lot of the time. And so if you want to win that game, the way that you do it is by asserting yourself directly and saying, here is what I believe, here's why I am right, take it or leave it. And I've tried on my channel to refrain at times from actively criticizing people I disagree with, because I've just realized, like, what is the point? What is the point in spending your time doing, like, response videos? YouTube is just this cesspit of response videos to response videos to response videos, to the point where sometimes you see people literally clipping over audio of themselves. Like, there's edited versions of themselves being paused and then responded to by their opponents, and then they pause their opponent's response to them to talk over their opponent, and the video ends up ballooning until it's like 6 hours long. It's absurd. It's absurd to engage with the internet or with the world that way. Just assert your opinion straightforwardly and let them be there. But what I didn't know until recently about this Buckminster Fuller quote is that after he proposed it, he also proposed a new model of how to live. He proposed a floating city, basically a seastead. Seasteading is a very popular idea amongst a very specific portion of the political spectrum right now. Very, very libertarian right idea. So anarcho-capitalists, minarchists, Hoppians, anybody in the Libertarian Party or the Free State Project, broadly speaking, anybody in those groups is going to gravitate towards this idea of seasteading. And that's partly because its founder, Patrice Friedman, is a part of this sort of familial legacy of libertarianism. He is a third-generation libertarian scholar. His father was David Friedman, and David Friedman is the founding thinker, debatably, of anarcho-capitalism. He wrote The Machinery of Freedom, which is the sort of seminal text for anarcho-capitalists. And his father was Milton Friedman, who is considered more or less the founding thinker behind neoliberalism and behind modern libertarian economic thought. So third generation. I also happen to know, because I've listened to a lot of David Friedman and Milton Friedman and Patrice Friedman in interviews and debates and talking to one another, I know that David Friedman was raised in this household by Milton Friedman, where they actually had to debate at the dinner table. That was one thing they did, and I think that's a really beautiful, interesting thing to do with your children, to sit around the dinner table and have, like, philosophical and political debates. I mean, it's nerdy as hell, but I would love to do that with kids one day. I think that would be beautiful. And so David Friedman had to grow up his whole life kind of debating his father on the merits of his alternative libertarianism called anarcho-capitalism. So these ideas have had to be sort of steel-manned within this tight-knit ideological family for years to get to the point where they're at, and I think that honestly makes them pretty impressive. I think that's why they hold so much water intellectually with so many people. What I'm seeking to do today is to take this idea of seasteading from anarcho-capitalists and sort of deterritorialize it and bring it into the broader political discussion so that people who maybe aren't free market libertarian, aren't anarcho-capitalist, can see this idea and think, oh, no, this is a good idea for everyone. So let's start with the environmental impact. This man, Ricardo, has a proposal to feed the world using seaweed and algae products. Algae actually grows by consuming a lot of the pollutants and the CO2 that ends up in our oceans because of our polluting of the environment. So if we were to scale up production of algae and fully domesticate it the way we do corn and wheat and other basic crops, we could actually take CO2 out of the atmosphere and depollute the oceans through this policy. Most of the oceans are actually more like a desert because you go far out enough and it's too deep for anything to exist at the surface. Everything tends to exist in what's called the red zone, which is this sort of very deep area of the water. And so with projects like OTEC, seasteaders seek to take nutrients from the bottom of the ocean and pull them up to the top to create photosynthesizing plants at the level that human beings actually interact with. This is akin to creating rainforests in the desert. Think about how much CO2 could be subtracted from the atmosphere if we really had the power to build rainforests in the desert. And not just in any desert, in the largest deserts on Earth, because oceans are so much bigger than land. Now, my criticism of the sort of libertarian anarcho-capitalist approach to seasteading is that they seem to operate under the assumption that the best way to go about this is to put all of their ideals together into one package and then try that all at once. So all of their libertarian ideas about markets and society paired with the use of things like cryptocurrency, paired with the belief in the value of tourism and ethical philanthropic investment. So they rely very heavily on very wealthy donors to fund these things. They believe that the combination of all of that and seasteading in international waters where you're not bound by the law of any given nation state, that's a recipe for success. And I would argue that if you're trying to create a fundamental revolutionary change in the way people live, and I think that's what seasteading is, you don't want to pair that with multiple other deeply experimental emerging ways of doing things. And cryptocurrency is, I feel, still in that very deeply experimental phase. So to be like, oh hey, we're going to build this city in the middle of the ocean, but also we're going to build it entirely with cryptocurrency as its main source of money. Well, what if your project fails because of the cryptocurrency, but the building on the ocean was in fact a success? Well, now you've sunk two projects by only sinking one. I don't think that's a good idea. And I don't think there's anything about the idea of building cities on the ocean that is inherently separate from left-wing politics. Recently, there has been a turn in left-wing politics led by Ezra Klein's and Derek Thompson's publishing of the book Abundance. And one of the things that they talk about is a massive simplification of the process of government so that government can directly involve itself in achieving big dream projects, constructing massive amounts of housing, massive amounts of infrastructure, and electrifying our grid are some of the proposals they talk about. This recent book draws off of numerous prior thinkers that I was influenced by before Ezra Klein was talking about any of this. I kind of feel like Ezra Klein stole my thunder. If I had any idea that it was going to be this popular of an idea, I would have made that video first, damn it. But yeah, I've been reading Jennifer Polka and Mariana Mazzucato since prior to the publication of Abundance, and I've thought for the longest while now that these are the exact sorts of ideas that the left needs. If we are the party of government on the left, then we should want the government to be able to do big things. And those big things, those infrastructure projects, could include things like, as Mariana Mazzucato cites, going to the moon. She says that that project, trying to go to the moon, was such an inspirational project that it drew together all of our resources of government, and it allowed us to achieve something that we couldn't have achieved otherwise. We need those moonshot ideas. Quite literally, she calls it like mission capitalism, or mission-driven government. Well, here's a possible mission. Here's a mission that could be taken on by a state or a city. Really anywhere that touches the coast could form a beginning seastead as a coastal extension of the city, with the plan of pushing it out to sea as it develops and as time goes on. The project would start with the construction of farming, because just like in the western frontier, the blue frontier starts with the construction of farms, and the towns come later. You have to be able to sustain people with food production for people to actually want to live there and have commerce there, and so on. There is not necessarily any reason why a government could not functionally endorse a project like this. Free market libertarians would probably say that a government can never do it because it's necessarily too bureaucratic and inefficient and slow and incapable. But somebody on the left, like Ezra Klein, would say the government is currently very slow and bureaucratic and incapable. We have shot ourselves in the foot in terms of our ability for the government to actually achieve its stated goals. But we can fix that. We can get rid of the barriers and obligations that we place on our own government. We don't need this much quote-unquote democratic accountability. We need real democratic accountability, but when our elected officials are trying to do something that the people want to see get done, and that gets slowed down by bureaucratic procedure after bureaucratic procedure until what the people want doesn't happen, then is that really democratic accountability, or is it a hindering of democracy actually being achieved? I think that a true democratic state could fund massive innovational projects, and one of the innovational projects for the 21st century is building floating cities. Hello, Dominic from the future here. I can't believe I forgot to include in my video on seasteading the most important reason why I think seasteading is such a cool idea. The other reasons are kind of objective claims, right? I'm making an objective claim that you can fix the environment through seasteading. And somebody who knows more about the science than me might be able to just objectively say, nuh-uh, right? Here's a more subjective, idealistic, sort of utopian claim as to why building cities on the water would be a really great thing to pursue. Because they're modular and they can move around. A lot of the images of seasteading are these hexagonal grid systems. Imagine if, in order to move across town, you didn't have to pack up all your stuff and move from one house to another. You just floated your floating house to a different location. I think that would be pretty cool. Imagine a floating city that moves around such that downtown is accessible to everyone at different points in the year. Imagine all the possibilities of constantly rearranging our infrastructure when necessary, because it's all on floating platforms that can detach from one another and reattach where needed. I think that the possibility of that in the future, if we were able to get to that point technologically, it would immediately become obvious that that is a more desirable way of building cities than to build them locked down on land. And so while there may be significant technological barriers to getting there, once we are there, it's just so much more desirable from the perspective of a city planner or a city builder that it will be unstoppable, I think.